You finally booked the road trip. The route is mapped. The stops are loaded into Google Maps. The playlist is ready. And somewhere around day 3, you realize that you haven't really enjoyed anything yet. You're calculating drive times at 6 a.m., skipping meals to stay on schedule, trying to squeeze in one more overlook before sunset. And the only thing you're really feeling is tired. Hi, I'm Teresa from an acre in the city. I've traveled to all 50 states and over 82% of the National Park Service sites. I've learned that some trips don't feel exhausting because you planned them badly. They feel exhausting because you tried to make them do too much. I've done both kinds of trips, the overstuffed ones and the slower ones. And the difference between them is something that most travel content doesn't talk about. This channel is for people that actually want to enjoy their road trips, not just survive them. And that means building trips around real experiences instead of running down a checklist that someone else made for you. Because the hidden cost of trying to see it all usually don't show up until you're halfway through the trip, wondering why you're not having more fun. There's this pressure to see it all, like this invisible rule book in travel culture. And most people don't realize they're following it until they're miserable, somewhere around mile 400 on a trip they've planned for months. Social media doesn't show you the 3-hour wait to get into the park, or the time sitting in traffic at an overlook, like Logan Pass in Glacier National Park. Totally crazy there. Social media will show you the 45-second clip at the top. Travel blogs don't tell you what it feels like to rush through 6 places in one day. They just tell you that these are must-see locations. And after a while, it creates this quiet pressure that says, if you skip something, you're doing the trip wrong. That pressure is real, especially on bucket list trips. Because once you invested the money, the PTO, the planning, it feels like you need to maximize every second of your trip to make it worthwhile. That's usually the moment the trip starts to feel exhausting instead of exciting. Let's talk about some of the hidden costs that no one seems to talk about. Overpacking an itinerary doesn't just wear you out. It quietly works against every reason why you wanted to take the trip in the first place. The first cost is burnout, physical and mental. And road trip burnout hits a bit differently because you can't really take a rest day without feeling like you're falling behind. The second cost is financial. Rush travelers spend more. Fast food, because there's no time to stop somewhere good. Last-minute hotels, because the route changed. Extra fuel, because the itinerary wasn't realistic. Trying to maximize the trip often maximizes stress and overspending. But the third cost is the one that surprises me the most. The memories, they just don't stick. I've been known to pack too many stops in a 5-day trip, and a month later, I could barely tell you what half of them looked like because I was never fully present anywhere. The whole trip felt like a logistics operation, constant clock watching, and eventually, you stop experiencing the trip and start managing it. If you're in planning mode right now and want some structure that actually helps you avoid this, I created something called 5 Days to Your Perfect Outdoor Adventure. It walks you through 5 steps to help you plan your next trip without the overwhelm, so you can build a trip that feels good while you're on it. I'll link that below. So what does slowing down actually look like? The trip that completely changed in how I look at planning road trips wasn't longer, wasn't more expensive. It was just less crowded. I cut the number of stops almost in half. I added one completely unscheduled afternoon, and I told myself, if I miss something, it'll still be there next time. That mindset kind of changed everything, because that free afternoon turned into one of the best meals I had in the whole entire trip. A conversation with a local, pointing me in the direction of a trail that I didn't have on my radar. An hour of just sitting quietly and actually looking at the landscape, instead of just taking photos of it and rushing back to the car. None of that was on the itinerary, and all of that was what I remembered the most. That's the part that I think social media gets backwards sometimes. More stops don't automatically create a better trip. Sometimes they just create more proof that you were there. So you need to build yourself a more honest itinerary. A relaxed itinerary doesn't mean an empty itinerary. Again, it just means an honest one. One of the biggest shifts that helped me was separating my stops into 2 categories: must-sees and nice-to-sees. Because not everything on your list carries the same emotional weight. Once you know what actually matters the most, the trip gets much easier to shape. Another thing that helps, building your driving days around realistic timing, not optimistic timing, because road trips almost always take longer than you think. Gas stops, construction, traffic, wanting ice cream, getting distracted at some random turnout. That's part of the experience too. Adding a half day with no agenda somewhere in the middle of the trip might be one of the smartest planning decisions that you can make. Not at the end, where you're already exhausted. In the middle, before burnout has a chance to take over. If this kind of realistic road trip advice is helpful to you, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming. I'm sure you've heard this before. Enjoy the journey, not just the destination. I think new road trippers are much more vulnerable to the see-it-all trap because travel content makes it seem like the benchmark is epic. But honestly, the most meaningful trips aren't usually the ones that are the most packed. They're the ones where you're actually paying attention. Some of the best memories happen in the in-between moments. The ice cream stop you should have stopped at, the weird roadside attraction, a random conversation with a local, the sunset you didn't really plan for. You don't need to see everything to make the trip count. You just need to be present for the parts you choose, because a trip where you checked almost every box but don't remember anything isn't actually a successful trip. A trip where you saw less but felt everything, that's the one you talk about for years later. Now you know why overpacked itineraries can quietly drain the joy out of a trip. There's another layer that most people don't talk about, because sometimes, even when you plan carefully, a trip can still feel strangely off. Watch this next video on the real reason why some trips feel so disappointing, even when you planned everything right, because understanding that might completely change the way you travel. Until next time, happy travels.